Hello again. Thank you,
Hi.
Sophia. Thank you, Dr. Ang, for the fantastic talk. So on the last session today, we'll take a look about bringing the AI-ECG to a clinical practice. So there are some revolutionary capabilities that have been demonstrated in the literature and that you heard about today. Not only improved ECG interpretation performance, but even detection of endpoints like underlying cardiomyopathies, other structural heart disease, or even prediction of future risk or outcomes. And yet, for all this huge promise, barriers still remain and impede wide adoption of these new technologies. To answer the question of the task, in the chat, news does not include these AI capabilities today. And we want to bring these capabilities to the practice as soon as we can. But there does seem to be a missing piece between the literature and clinical practice. And that is what we're faced with. And that is what I will try in this talk. I'll try to talk a little bit about the barriers and talk a little bit about the research that is being done to address them. So we talked about the fundamental barriers before. Some important ones are, again, the lack of interpretability. DNN output cannot be automatically explained in terms of structured reasoning that can easily be conveyed to clinicians for context for them to assess and utilize the output fully in a way that is empowering to them. The potential to bias is related with the issue of interpretability. So all these concerns are kind of different sides of the same coin. Again, in different contexts, any kind of errors in the labels of the data or incompleteness of diversity of context or any kind of difference between the training and validation population and what would be encountered in practice. So bias can persist even after external validation has been demonstrated in some cases. So these things are what make these technologies difficult to integrate in practice in a way that empowers the clinician. So with the lack of durability and potential for bias, that can create burdens and trade-offs for the clinician. There are huge positives there, but we're talking about mitigating these trade-offs to make these models much more successful in practice and able to gain the trust of the community. So we talked before about the fantastic research being done about explainability. CLNC maps is one example. These are two of the plots that I showed in my first talk. So these are three of the best groups in the world. A little US centric, I apologize for that. But you see that in some of the leading literature on saliency maps. First of all, these are not straightforward to understand for non-experts and therefore integrate in practice. And also they leave things to be desired. It's a little technical, but for hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, for example, it seems very questionable that there is no importance given on the deep and narrow Q wave, which is a very characteristic marker of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Or similar for the left bundle branch block, why some QRSs are highlighted and others are not, why the QRST discordance is not highlighted. So these are questionable things, even in the leading literature. Again, these are some of the best practitioners in the world. And if anything, the explainability aspect might be successful if it allows you to probe and question the model and understand how to use it. In this clinical usability study, clinicians did find saliency maps only slightly clinically relevant and slightly helpful, but they also talk about the difficulty of bringing new kinds of information to practice and that clinical practice itself will change over time. And that providing new mechanistic insights is a huge benefit that could change clinical practice over time. So it's a very complicated, multidimensional clinical usability discussion. And another issue is, so Dr. Ang gave an entire talk about assessing the literature. Here's one example from me that shows, especially underappreciation of positive predictive value in practice is one thing that I mentioned in my talk. So I'm taking an example on hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. This is a structural heart disease endpoint that is previously inaccessible from the automated ECG. It's very rare. Its prevalence is 0.2 to 0.5%, but it would make a huge difference in patients' lives if they could be detected early with a screening application. And it has to be screening because it can very often be asymptomatic. So it has to be applied to every ECG. And there are some promising performance metrics being reported in the literature. Again, these are some of the best groups in the world. And you see numbers like area under the curve at the 96, 97%, sensitivity of 90%. And it's very easy to get an impression that these models are much closer to practice and that we might be able to catch 90% of these patients with every single ECG. But the reality is that many of these publications have an enriched population with enhanced prevalence of the endpoint. So this study has a prevalence of about 5%, which is very common in the literature for HCM, which is much, much higher than the true prevalence. So it takes some math, and again, finding the true positive predictive value for your population can be very difficult. It takes some math, but the implied prevalence here is about a few percent, more directly reported in this paper at 1%. So such low positive predictive value makes these models really difficult to apply in practice. So it's an extremely powerful literature that shows something, but it is more a proof of principle rather than this model being itself applicable in practice at this operating parameters. So, but to clarify on that, low positive predictive value means a very high number of false positive detections. At the few percent level, that means you could get something like 50 false positive detections before you get a true positive detection. So a true positive could have a huge impact on a hypertrophic cardiomyopathy patient and change their lives. But it has to be balanced against a significant burden from all these false positives. That means increased burden on echo labs and healthcare resources, and also harm on the patients from false positives. And again, the lack of interpretability just makes this all the more difficult to handle in actual practice. So we're talking about trade-offs here. Interpretability, false positives, bias that arises from different conditions on the population that the model was developed, then it will be applied on practice. These are all trade-offs that make it much more difficult to bring these models into clinical practice. And reducing these trade-offs is our goal, the goal of the community that is working hard on this. So taking a step back to reassess some of these weaknesses that we talked about, these weaknesses should be seen in the context of what is already in practice. So it's the first time that we're mentioning it today, but this is what ECG interpretation that is in practice now from a system like Tovacel from GE. Tovacel decomposes this ECG waveform into thousands of structural features, and that is what ECG interpretation is in practice right now. And these systems encode expert reasoning and guidelines, making these rules much more generalizable and with much more reduced potential for this kind of data-driven bias. The diagnosis is, in principle, fully interpretable. Any kind of ECG interpretation statement that is given by Tovacel, in principle, you can always know where it came from. Now, in principle, because in practice, people don't know where an interpretation comes from. So this is an opportunity to see the weaknesses of DNNs in the light of what is in principle strengths of these expert criteria systems. But it is also an opportunity to reevaluate these systems in a new light. But in principle, they have a kind of transparency and structure that is very important to make these tools more usable in practice. And by the way, the criteria are much more specific, having a library of more than 1,000 statements in the case of TOSL. The specificity on those endpoints is at the 99.5% level very often. And controlling false positives is very important in practice, which is again is an aspect that may be missing from deep neural network solutions. So of course we need to leverage AI and machine learning to improve ECG interpretation. There are huge opportunities and huge potential there. But there are trade-offs that we're trying to mitigate around losing the interpretability, reasoning, and specificity that are in use now in expert criteria systems. So that is some of our research that we presented at the International Congress on Electrocardiology this year. We aim to leverage machine learning to optimize expert criteria systems for ECG interpretation, trying to get the best of both worlds. So using machine learning as a kind of data-driven optimization process that was never used before for these expert systems, but in a way that makes the machine learning products, the extracted criteria, fully interpretable and transparent. And that could enhance criteria-based interpretation more efficiently than ever before possible, representing a leap forward for these systems, while also being a first attempt at comprehensively overcoming all the weaknesses of AI methods that we identified. So we are applying this in a way that as a first target to improve total cell diagnosis in a pilot application, aiming to reduce false positives and false negatives. And on a pilot application, we aim for two endpoints, left bundle branch block and atrial fibrillation. Both of these are highly significant and impactful, as you probably know. And they represent a wide spectrum for us to understand the impact of this application. Also, the performance of these two endpoints relative to the AI-ECG literature is very different. Left bundle branch block is identified as very weak against the AI-ECG literature, while atrial fibrillation not so much. And so I will show a pilot application, a quick demonstration here with a publication expected in a few months on external performance validation. So this we get just a little bit technical on ECG interpretation on left bundle branch block, but just to demonstrate the concept, these are machine learning extracted criteria to indicate a false positive diagnosis of left bundle branch block. And this is what fully interpretable, meaningful criteria look like. These are extracted with data-driven machine learning methods, and as you can see, they are fully interpretable. And just to walk through them, even though these are fully extracted from data, they correspond to well-known guidelines, expert guidelines for left bundle branch block. There are various variations of these guidelines, but practically all of them have an indication of non-monomorphic R wave laterally or short R wave peak time laterally in V5 and V6, or lack of QRST discordance. These are all criteria that are missing, are contraindications for the presence of left bundle branch block. And so we find that in a data-driven way, we can practically reproduce the expert guidelines just from the just learning from the data from physician annotations. And we find that Tovacel is underutilizing this information. I will talk more about it later, but again, an expert system like Tovacel has never been optimized with this kind of data-driven techniques at this scale. So we find in some cases some holes in the criteria, but we can now improve and fix them more efficiently than ever before possible. And there's this last criterion here that it refers to leads V1 to V3. Now, V1 to V3 are leads that you won't find in any guidelines for left bundle branch flow in all their iterations. So we were confused by that, but to expert cardiologists, like probably to Dr. Arnold, this would make sense. A longer R wave in the early precordial leads indicates longer normal septal depolarization and therefore activation of the left bundle branch. So it is reciprocal evidence to the presence of Q waves laterally, which does exist in all guidelines. But the data really prefer the early precordial leads indication of that than in the lateral leads. And it could make sense since those leads are directly on the left bundle branch. It is the kind of deeper inference that could be plausibly relevant for deep endpoints like inference for good CRT responders. So it is a kind of uh, the deepest promise of machine learning, to the ability to draw meaningful insights that were inaccessible before. Again, not inaccessible to really deep experts that could be well aware of the ECG markers, the ECG science of this, but probably to the majority of practitioners, including to our team, since this was not even existent in the guidelines. This was something completely new that came out of the data. And again, the ability to fully interpret that in a fully meaningful way is very powerful. So as a quick demonstration of how machine learning methods can improve ECG interpretation with full interpretability, 12SL is one of the best expert systems for ECG interpretation in the world, but it is significantly imperfect. This kind of manual way to produce this criteria is difficult, and apparently holes in the criteria and errors have persisted for decades. But this kind of data-driven optimization at this scale of data has never been used before. So with machine learning methods, we can improve these criteria systems more efficiently than ever before. And we demonstrate that we can do it without sacrificing interpretability and the reasoning that can be encoded in these criteria. So the obvious next step is to talk about structural heart disease, even for endpoints that are well beyond what current criteria systems like 12SL even attempt to interpret, like cardiomyopathies or risk prediction. These criteria and structured ECG features can be used for these endpoints as well. Besides, it is well known that ECG markers for these endpoints are identified in the literature for many, many years now. So what is emerging in the literature is attempts for hybrid systems with DNNs along with structured features, especially if they can be optimized with machine learning. That could be an attempt to get the best of both worlds. That could be very powerful to bring these new capabilities to practice. So we could get the kind of deep brute force data-driven inference from deep neural networks, hopefully without sacrificing and making up some of the explainability and reasoning and specificity that criteria can provide. It's trying to provide the opposite of the black box paradigm. And again, trying to empower the clinician, reduce the painful trade-offs that come with all the weaknesses of deep neural networks as a means to actually realize in practice the benefits of machine learning capabilities. So there's a lot of research and progress. We're talking about implementation science for these models. Again, there is a very active field called explainable AI with a very specific focus on the ECG. Again, some great groups, literature from some great groups reported here. Further work on addressing bias, improving generalizability and developing interpretability methods. If these goals can be achieved, the benefits for these patients can be transformational. And all of these three things are subtly one and the same. They are very well connected. So the focus on interpretability kind of gets at everything. This expanding on the reasons why explainable AI-ECG can empower the clinician in practice. And of course, randomized control trials should be the gold standard about bringing these models to practice. And clinical usability, I barely touched on usability really, only on the fundamental components like interpretability. But there's a lot of active research, and it's a very important area for understanding of the requirements for AI and machine learning tools, what are the preferences of practitioners, and what are the real-world trade-offs. And again, there can be very strong arguments made against black box models, but black box deployment itself can be very acceptable, and it will probably be and it has been the first wave that these deep neural networks are coming to practice, but they face barriers to adoption. They come with trade-offs. So in a more advanced iteration of the implementation for these tools, we can reduce the black box nature to build trust in the community. And then there's definitely a time dimension to all this. Further down the line, we could have deep neural networks running everything if the community has built enough trust in these tools. But we're not there yet. We're not there today. So thank you for the attention. This is just a summarization. There are some real world barriers that remain before realizing the transformational power of AI solutions that are seen in the literature. But there is impressive work in progress by many leading groups in the field. We want to demonstrate that we can use these methods to enhance expert criteria systems more efficiently than ever before, and in a fully transparent manner, and aim to use these capabilities to enhance deep inference for deep endpoints. There are rapid advancements from the entire field towards reducing trade-offs and building trustworthy machine learning systems that empower the clinician and can be integrated in clinical workflows. Thank you, and I hope there's time for questions.
Thank you so much, Manolis. Great insights. There is still this remaining question. There hasn't popped in any new ones. So if you have any questions to Manolis or Dr. Ung, please don't hesitate to ask those. But meanwhile, Manolis, there is a question: does news include AI machine learning? If yes, how does it work? And I think maybe this presentation actually answered this one, that as of today, no.
Yeah, as I said in the presentation, today there's not. We want to bring these capabilities to clinical practice as soon as possible. And we are developing the solutions, and we're developing the research to do that. While at the same time, regulations, of course, are a huge barrier for many of these solutions. Probably in Europe more than the US. But the talk hopefully provided a lot of context why some of these regulations might be justified.
Thank you.